So yeah, I was thinking about this on the train down. So this is a presentation that I prepared in the inadequate conditions of the Wi-Fi service yesterday and early this morning. But basically, I think there's a lot of things I think we can think about. I mean, clearly we talked already about history, now, and these questions are the ones in the document in front of you. Q1 about the importance of AD 1000, Q4 innovative methods of chronology. We're kind of aware of historical events. What I've done here in this order is go from sort of famous ecclesiastical events, state events, lives of individuals, through the scholarship, the development of glossing, to individual events such as catastrophes. And so we're kind of used to this. We're used to the kind of historical study. But I also think that one of the problems with historians in Parchment is this the overemphasis of the text itself. The text is hugely important. These are material objects which I find extraordinary that anyone with a library card can go and handle. Think about the value of this material. And yet they'll fire X-rays at it, they'll put lasers at it. They won't allow us to rip molecules out of the manuscripts, apparently. And of course, they digitize it. So there's a huge amount of digitization going. So it's about the text. And the way to think about these documents to me is that you can handle them because they contain text, and the text is the important thing. But to my mind, these are extraordinarily material objects. And so, the texts themselves, we have the text stakes, we have ecclesiastical text about land. And those are obviously things that we can impinge upon in the question 4 and question 6 topics that were mentioned in the text from last time I wasn't there. So the thing is, think about things like state texts. Well, here is the famous Baron's letter, which was never sent to the Pope, but you have all of these wonderful wax seals. I don't know if these are attached by silk or not, but that's an incredible record of bee activity, bee genetics, and the distribution of plants. The silk itself, where has it come from? Has it come from Byzantium? Has it come from Baghdad? Is it Chinese silk, or is it the more recent at that point Spanish production? And the parchment, what is it made of? I mean, these are all the material nature of this fantastic material. And so it's actually quite interesting because this is Umberto Albrella taking data on bone and comparing it with the results from Doomsday. And notice that Doomsday is really overemphasizing sheep compared to what he's actually finding both on urban and rural sites. So again, we can sort of look at the text and look at the archaeological evidence and see how those two compare. Think about the church. I mean, church undergoes enormous expansion at this time. This is just a plot of the increase in frequency of Cistercian orders. This incredible pyramid scheme, you have a daughter abbey, which meant a daughter abbey, and this thing expands hugely. And of course, all of these need libraries. There's a massive increase in parchment production in text. It all needs scribes. This whole thing is an extraordinary expansion in written text. So this is happening at state level. It's also happening at ecclesiastical level. And so think about those texts themselves, and there's a hierarchy of value that we perceive. And we would never imagine that these valuable Bibles would be reused, but they're ripped up and they're used in bindings again. But it's a hierarchy of what do they perceive as the most valuable texts? What about the importance of Gospels versus gloss Gospels? This is an example of gloss Luke here. Liturgical manuscripts, hagiographies. And then do their perceptions of the value of the text actually illustrate themselves in the value of materials they've used to make those texts, in the skins, in the skill of the scribes and the artists, in the value of the bindings. Of course, we've lost, sadly, many of those high-status bindings now. But clearly those are things that already have been considered, some of them, by scholars. And think about the artist. The artist is probably the area which has been most well-studied. Think about the artistic schools, the subject matter of those and the materials. But one of the things I think is really quite curious now with archaeology is we can do some just crazy things. So here we can look at the tooth of a lady that died in a convent in 13th century Germany. And we can see that she was actually preparing lapis lazuli because we actually can see the ground lapis in the calculus on her teeth. So we could start using osteological evidence, begin to tie artistic activity, which I think is a really fascinating work that Anita Radini is doing at the University of York. So I'm not going to focus so much on that. Think about the scribes, though. What's extraordinary is that paleographers have done an amazing job of identifying individual scribes. And those scribes are being obviously used in governance. You think about the way that the scribes are training other scribes. You have this wonderful stylistic variation. And what about the organization, the scriptoria? How are these things working? And so looking at those texts, for instance, we've been focusing a lot on Christ Church Canterbury, and you have these two competing scriptoria, and you get this sense that the cathedral church is much better organised, because the way they organise the parchment in the documents is better organised. So everything switches to this so-called continental style of flesh and hair sides, whereas at the Augustinian scriptorium, it takes a lot longer to sort of switch to that activity. So how are the scriptoria being organised? And the most extraordinary thing for us about this, and I'll come out later, is just the species they're using. I'll start with the bindings, and I kind of work down from the bindings ultimately to the animals. So in terms of the bindings, this is work that really comes out of Naomi's fallow deer project. So this is where she kind of inspired me. So when we got the results, we talked to Naomi about it, and she said, this is really interesting. And the point was, we were analysing bindings and finding the presence of roe deer. And she said, well, of course you are. These are ecclesiastical documents pointing out the fact there's a much higher instance of roe deer at this time around religious sites. And this is related to the humoral theory. I love your idea that archaeologists think about ancient theories rather than more recent linguistic ideas. I love that paper. And so you can start thinking about this. And this is actually some historical text from time of Charlemagne to the Abbey of Saint-Denis, where they're allowed to kill their animals as long as they use the deerskin for binding. So, are these practical? Are these materialistic? Well, what are the decisions that are being made to decide on which bindings are being used? And people have said in the text there's calfskin, pigskin, and deerskin. We're only so far finding deerskin. We're pretty sure there must be some calf there as well. We haven't found any pig at all. I mean, whether that's significant, I don't know. And then the curious thing that we've found more recently is that when we start to map this, so we see a lot of deerskin early in France. We have the Gloss Luke, which is also deer. But then we see the Cistercians just go crazy with sealskin, And so what's going on there? And it gets even more weird if it's true. So don't trust this data. I'll show this data because it's so effing cool. But so we've just done some genetics on this, which you need to redo. And it's harp seal. And harp seal is an Arctic species. So what? But we need to check that more. So, so again, understanding the way that they use, well, sadly we've lost so many bindings. But now we're beginning to think, again, about the decisions of the animals. Is it, why are you using this fatty seal skin to bind these documents? And these are the important texts. So it is the foundational text for Fountains Abbey. It's a Life of Bernard of Clairvaux. These are important texts getting bound in sealskin. But, so there's the Cistercians massively moving out, and the binding style is being copied. The materials they're using are being transmitted. So that's really kind of interesting. And then what about the state? Well, so Bishop Richard, talking about the Dialogues of the Exchequer, he's saying that you should use sheepskin because it delaminates, and that's, as a consequence, it's much better for legal text. And they're saying, well, maybe that's true. Not true. It absolutely is true. So if you look at archival documents in the UK, 99.x% are all on sheepskin. So a tradition happens in the UK. And is that coming from Bishop Richard? And that goes right the way through to the latest mortgages from the 1960s. Everything is produced on sheepskin. It becomes a tradition, I think. And it's related initially to the delamination process. But ultimately, it actually comes down to tradition, I think, because the final sheepskins are actually split. They're delaminated anyway, so you could still rub them and you would actually be able to erase them and rewrite on the surface. But the early stuff, the fact that the upper layer of sheepskin will peel away, so if you try and rub away the evidence, it'll be showing. It's a natural anti-fraud device. Is that a tradition that gets developed in Britain? And clearly you have very different things happening elsewhere. But again, how much is that pattern of parchment used simply tied to the available animals? You can see in Spain, another sheep rearing region, lots of wool. France, Germany, up in Scandinavia, it's mainly calf. Italy, it's mainly goat. Italy actually split. So in Sicily, which has got a dairying economy, it's mainly sheep. It's a sheep dairying economy. In Northern Italy, it's mainly goat. So interesting things happening in terms of just, are they making decisions about materials for practical purposes like sheepskin, or are they just choosing what's available? Which they are certainly in the case of, say, pocket Bibles. That's another story later. And again, what about the value of skin? So we always thought that calf skin was the most important material for parchment. It now appears sheepskin is the best material. But in the late antique period, they forgot how to make it. And so basically in Britain, they kind of invent calfskin as the top material, and then that gets translated back into Europe. So so you go from an idea of sheep, goat, calf being the order initially in late antique period to calf, goat, sheep being the order in the medieval period. And that is to do with the loss of craft skill to make very high quality sheepskin. And then you've got, the quality of the sheep themselves. And I want to know, are we looking at hairy animals? Are we looking at wool animals, fleeced animals? Because we know that the best parchment is made from hairy sheep. But of course, we know that in the medieval period, they're raising a lot of wool sheep. And of course, the historical evidence is talking a lot about wool sheep. So luckily, we now have a marker, a genetic marker. We haven't used it yet. We need to develop an assay for it, which will actually discriminate hair sheep from wool sheep. And so that's one of the things we want to try looking at in the parchment. Similarly, the age of the animals. These are very, very young animals, these calves that are being killed, 6 to 8 weeks of age, really, really short. And they're smaller than the adult sheep and goat that are used. And we'll also be looking at blemishes, and we can start to see disease. We're starting to see goat pox, for instance. And again, can we relate that historically to events that we know happened? And the curious thing about that as well is this is Umberto Alvaro's summary data. This is in the English Heritage Zooarchaeology manual. And notice the absence of calf, if I can show that, in the Norman period. Where's my screen? No, there we are, yes.
Oh, there's a pointer.
Yeah, I look for the video recording. And of course, we see, so they're not finding the calf bones, but we're finding calf skin everywhere. So what about the disconnect between those two? It seems really curious to me between the archaeological evidence and the direct material evidence in the texts themselves. And these are very young animals. And the other thing about what about the perception of calf skin? So this is a fascinating thing. This is Anneliese Benoit's work, where she has looked at, this is a calf that dies in utero. This is much later, so this is in the 14th century. But by the 14th century, calf skin is no longer a premier product. The mother has been flayed, but the calf skin has been left in utero. That calf skin has no perceived value anymore. And I think this is actually related to the interplay between the value of parchment and paper. By this time, codices are starting to produce, on paper rather than parchment. So there's interesting things going on there, and there's some fascinating work to be done on the laws around flaying and how that actually relates to the exploitation of those materials. Okay, next one. Come on. Why is it not moving very... no. It's going too fast now. So yeah, and value of raw materials then. So, obviously I'm sure that the skin is a secondary product. They're really raising these animals for wool and for meat, I assume. And then the thing that really intrigues me is the salting. What evidence is there for the use of salt? Because to move these things around distance, you need salt. And it looks now that we have a marker to tell whether the skins are salted or not. So I now want to start using that as a tool to start looking at the availability of salt. And similarly, the origin of oak boards, and then look at distance of transport. So this is data from the value of parchment from the 13th century. Maybe it's been 14th century, and you're seeing here that the sheepskin at Beaulieu Abbey, the best sheepskin is worth less than the worst calfskin. This is some lovely work by Blair Hedges. So he's looking at the oak boards, and he's looking at the size of the wormholes, and so he can use that to look at the north-south production, so the sourcing of the wood for the boards from that. And so, I think there's a lot of interest that we could look at by looking at the products, to look at the raw materials and where the raw materials are sourced, and then actually look at in relation to other kinds of historical data. So this is on some of the wonderful work that was done. Oh, what's his name? Gavin Northern Ireland, on the value of grain. And of course, we have the scribes. What the great thing about paleographers is they know individual scribes. So that, for instance, we know we have folio written by Edward Bassan, and this is a picture of him presenting his document to the king, and he was known perhaps as sheep leather. So we can track the individual, and we can track them through their lives, and we can track them to the materials that they're choosing to use. And I'll talk more about that in my talk this evening. And of course, we can then link that to sort of the development of the text themselves, that we can track the scribes, we can track how the copying errors in the text. And then we can look at things like the glossing. So for instance, with gloss Bibles, that is something which actually really develops. And so the first glossing, the first glossing happens in about 1150 in Paris. And so looking at texts, we can know they must have been produced after this time. So we can begin to refine our chronologies as well, based upon the way the text is being constructed, and then tie that back to the very animals and the wood and whatever else is being used. And so, for instance, in the case of Christchurch, my scriptorium, you could look at the way in which there's an influx of scribes from Christchurch into St Augustine to sort out this place. It's a complete mess. They're not doing things properly. And so you can then look at the stylistic attributes as well as the way that the parchment is being made and the parchment is being put together. And what we're finding at this point, in the 12th century, is there's just such a huge amount of parchment that is being produced. And we can look at the glossing. There's so much being produced that we get this pattern in Canterbury in the 12th century of its calf sheep construction. We thought this was unique to one text. Bruce Barker Benfield from the Bodleian kindly got a whole bunch of texts together for us last May, and it turns out this is what is happening in Canterbury at this time. And to my mind, that's just indicating huge amounts of scribal production and simply not enough calf skin to go around. So actually begin to look at this as material property in terms of the draw it's taking on the livestock and where is this stuff coming from? Can we actually tell where it's coming from? I also want to begin to look at the future. I think one of the things we'll be able to do in the future is start looking at parchment as a craft material. This is just showing the scrape marks on two different pieces of parchment. They're from different times, but they're clearly made by different parchment makers. One is using a very punchy style, one is using a much more gentle style. They're both based upon the pattern of those scrape marks. They put the heads to the top and they're working down almost certainly on a square frame. But can we begin to understand the production styles and how they change with time? Can we locate the DNA of these animals using GPS on the parchment and then tie it to the archaeological record of the bone? Because the skins can move, the bones probably haven't moved. Can we actually barcode the scrape mark from the lunena, the scrape on the knife, and actually see the knife getting used over time, nick marks being generated, then the knife being sharpened? So can we learn more about the craft style? And then, so for instance, can we look at the ways that, based upon the parchment, the animals are being used? So for instance, if you have something where you're using oxen for traction, you're more interested in having male cattle, whereas once you move over to horses as the main form of traction, presumably you're more interested in maintaining herds so that the slaughter of your young calves may shift between female animals being killed in the pre-Norman period and maybe male calves being killed in the post-Norman period. And the data we have so far is only pre-Norman, but we see a predominance of female calves being killed at 6 weeks, which is a heck of a sacrifice. So that's something else. And I think the other great thing is I'm convinced that in 20 years or so's time, the genome of every single piece of parchment will be automatically constructed, and we will have a complete genealogy of all of the parchment pieces and how they relate to each other, because the cost is coming down so rapidly, and then the techniques we now know we can non-destructively extract DNA from parchment. So it becomes an incredibly rich source to compare essentially the written text with the genomic bibliography. So I think that's going to happen. We can also look at runs of homozygosity within these things. We can look at herd size, herd management. With GPS, we can locate where these animals have come from. And also looking at the bacteria on there, what we're seeing now is the presence of halophiles on the parchment, which to me means salted skins. So I think we can look for the presence of halophiles on parchment to track the use of salt, looking at the movement of salted skins versus non-salted. So I think that's an interesting area to go for. So finally, that's my final slide, is that I think parchment is the material culture of individuals. I think people have just looked at the text and forgotten the material culture. I think it's an enormous opportunity for us to use parchment within this project to highlight, because particularly with people who are so used to the text, and think, hang on a minute, there's a whole other story to be told from the things that you've been studying based upon the material itself. Okay.
Great, thank you.
Okay.